Hello, students, and welcome. This is Mr. Kitts. Today, we're going to be going over some people and events that have impacted the world really toward the end of the 20th century, kind of into what we consider present day, or now, really. So the next two lessons are kind of modern times, modern day, what you're dealing with in current events. So most of you are probably either close to driving, maybe you have your permits, maybe you've driven a little with your parents, something to that effect. And if not, you will be driving very soon. And when you start driving, it gives you a lot of freedom, but there's also a lot of cost that comes with driving. And every couple of days, you got to stop and you got to stop at the gas station and fill yourself up, right? Fill up with gas, whatever the case is. Um, every so often, you got to change the oil in your car and things of that nature. All of that stuff seems pretty commonplace, and you don't realize how expensive, how much it starts adding up until you own a car. Now, there's a group out there that actually has a major impact on oil, on the cost of oil, and your ability to drive around, your ability to afford oil, and things of that nature. And that group is called OPEC. And OPEC is a very large group of countries. So OPEC, I'm just going to flip, I'll come back to this in a second here. OPEC is these countries here. You see these couple of blue countries here. And essentially, they are the major oil distributing countries in the world. And instead of competing with each other, because we know that when people start to compete, what happens to the price of something? It drops, right? So when you have competition on the open market, that's usually good for the consumer. What these countries did is they said, you know what, let's form a group, okay, or an organization. And basically, we are going to control the price of what is a barrel of oil. And when a barrel of oil is expensive, it makes things really challenging for us. Because oil is not just your car, it's not just changing the oil in your car or getting gas. It's also in the middle of the winter. You know, when it starts getting cold come December, January, February, what will happen is you will need to heat your home. You need to put oil in your burner. And that oil is also made of the same crude oil that you get from OPEC, from barrels of oil. And when prices are up, so I can speak to the fact that like 10, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. I guess it was about 10 years ago. The price of oil spiked really, really high. Like to a point where I believe some places in this country, oil was up over $5 a gallon to get gas. Here on Long Island, it was like in the high fours. It was really, really painful when you're spending $5 a gallon on oil. And to heat your home was even worse because you're talking it was like $5 a gallon. And when you heat your home, you have to buy 100, 200, maybe 300 gallons of oil. That gets expensive. Now, right now, because of competition, there was some competition between OPEC and Russia, Russia actually, and that actually has created a drop in oil prices. So right now, oil prices are some of the cheapest that I've seen in a really long time. I believe I saw in Riverhead the other day something like $1.80 or $1.90 a gallon. That is incredibly cheap. But these prices will fluctuate. And many countries are very dependent on OPEC because they're the ones who set the prices, right? So here's world users. Please, sir, I'd like some more. So you're doing the whole like Oliver skit, right? Asking OPEC for more oil, right? Here's another cartoon. The US, right? Getting caught like a fish. I should learn from this, right? And here's OPEC, the fisherman guy, right? Putting it out there. Hey, you guys, and the US is hooked on oil. And if you think about it, it makes sense. A lot of the stuff that we use is based on oil. Even a lot of, say, our rubbers, are plastics, things like that. They're based, and a lot of them use oil or crude oil to be able to make them, right? And there's actually we have a pretty good video that we're going to have you guys watch today as well. Okay, so oil is a very important part, and honestly, you guys are going to deal with oil for probably most of your life until you start to see changes like maybe more electric cars or biodiesel or things like that. And, who knows? They've made a lot of advancements, but who knows when you'll have more access to cars like that. All right, so Pan-Africanism. This is a little different of a shift here. So now we're talking about Pan-Africanism and African unity. So rewind back, go back to December when we were talking about imperialism. And when we're talking about imperialism, we're talking about, right, a stronger country taking over a weaker country. So what happened is the countries of Africa, as we mentioned, were a lot of the countries that were being taken over. So Pan-Africanism was kind of this movement to promote unity and essentially get independence for a lot of these African nations. There was specifically for Kenya, there was a gentleman by the name of Jomo Kenyatta, and he was a driving factor of gaining independence for Kenya. And he was a part of this meeting. In other words, pushing for this idea that they wanted more freedom. Okay. We also, staying in Africa, we also talked about the apartheid. And there's two very important leaders, this guy specifically, okay, that's Nelson Mandela. And Mandela and this guy, this gentleman right here is named Bishop Desmond Tutu. They are the civil rights leaders who fight against the apartheid, or what we refer to as, probably an easier name to remember it as, is segregation. And we know what segregation is. We saw it here in the United States. Segregation, when you looked at America in the 60s, during the civil rights movement, the 50s, 60s, this was Dr. King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and various other people fighting against racism. And that's essentially what you have here in South Africa. Because don't forget, when we talk about South Africa, you're talking about a country that was controlled by the British. And the British did not want to give up power. So you have South Africans living there who are mainly black people, and they're essentially being controlled by the white British people. And Nelson Mandela is going to fight against this type of rule and say that, just like in this picture, these are not separate but equal. Just like when we saw, here in America, separate but equal with schools or bathrooms or buses or whatever the case was, they were saying, no, these were not separate but equal, and they fought against this to gain equality for the South African people. Okay, also staying in Africa, in the 90s, there was a pretty bad genocide that occurred in a place called Rwanda. Now, what this was about was the mass killing of the Tutsi ethnic group. They were the Tutsi tribe, and they were being murdered by the Hutu ethnic tribe. Okay, and we're not talking about like 100 people, 1,000 people. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people die during this genocide. And it was bad. People being murdered in the streets, gangs rising up of these Hutu groups, essentially just going around and indiscriminately killing men, women, and children. This, as you can see from the poster here, right, many of these leaders of the Hutus who were responsible for this were arrested or executed, captured for various forms of genocide. All right, sticking with this whole lovely idea of genocide, which is always very unpleasant to talk about, we'll talk about Pol Pot and a group called the Khmer Rouge. Now, this took place in Cambodia. So this is Cambodia here, right? So Cambodia is right here. This country you probably remember, Vietnam, right? Vietnam, when we talked about Vietnam, America fought a war there. So in this area here, you have communism, you have Ho Chi Minh running Vietnam, and this is Cambodia here. And for a while, Cambodia is going to be run by this guy, Pol Pot. And Pol Pot is definitely not a very nice guy. Vicious communist leader, you see him here. He is going to slaughter millions of Cambodians. And essentially, Pol Pot's idea, and this is a very strange one, was that he wanted to bring his country back to what was called an agrarian society. So if you had glasses on, if you were a doctor, if you were a lawyer, if you were a teacher, anybody who would have been deemed intelligent, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge had you executed. And many of them are buried in this, which was called the Killing Fields. And I'll explain why it looks like this in a second. But Pol Pot's idea was that by killing the smartest people of his country and basically bringing his country back to an agrarian society, he no longer had to deal with people trying to overthrow him or question him. Because remember, if you are smart, you question. You question why something is the way it is. You don't accept that, oh, that just happens. No, you question it. Well, Pol Pot wanted to get rid of anybody who would question his leadership. So he carried out these mass executions, and they buried most of the bodies in an area called the Killing Fields. Now, here's why they look so hilly like this. It was all even at one time, and then what they do is they dig these large mass graves and then fill them up with tons and tons of people. But here's the problem with bodies. They decompose. And when you have large bodies, large amounts of bodies in one area, and essentially when all the stuff decomposes with the exception of the bones, what happens is the earth basically decompresses. It falls down into these large pits like you see here. So if you tour the Killing Fields today, you'll see, and they have these memorials here set up. We also have a video that we're going to have you watch about this. But basically, when you tour them today, you can see all the divots and large sunken areas of where they had these mass graves. So this was a pretty horrific time for Cambodia. Now, believe it or not, what's going to happen is Vietnam, the same country that we fought, and their leader, Ho Chi Minh, is really going to not respect this whole Pol Pot thing and Khmer Rouge thing. And essentially, they're going to send an army in and put an end to this. All right. And the last topic we're going to cover today is something called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this guy, now, on your regents or if we wind up having one or whatever the case is, this guy right here is named Yasser Arafat. And you'll see where's the sort of this traditional headgear here, Palestinian headgear here. And what the PLO was, they're actually, the Israelis consider them a terrorist group. They are the representatives of the Palestinian people against Israel. Because don't forget, Israel's where we talk about Israel, there's the Palestinians living in Israel. And essentially what happens is somebody comes along and says, we're going to take 55% of your stuff. Well, the Palestinians didn't like that. And it kind of makes sense that they didn't like that. So this group was started as a way to kind of fight back against the Israelis. And they do perform acts of terror. They do perform extreme acts. And they are considered a terrorist group. But they have gained a lot of political power over the years. And they have had meetings. In fact, Jimmy Carter had a pretty important meeting with Arafat and his Israeli counterpart at Camp David. That was called the Camp David Accords. And that took place in the 70s. So basically, that's it for today, guys. If you have any questions, obviously email us. But this is Mr. Kitts signing off.